Hi, this is Pat Baldwin, talking about my final culminating project. So, talking about the last a bunch of activities that we were working on for the internship across the entire school year. So, this is probably going to be split up into two videos. So, you might have to just bounce back and forth. So, here we go. First, with the applications of data literacy. So, one of the things we needed to focus on was how impactful was some of the training we were providing for teachers and what was happening actually in the classroom. So, one of the things we needed to do was come up with a tool to be able to measure if we were seeing aspects of professional development in classrooms. So, this was one of the things where we collected a bunch of data across a couple of weeks worth of classroom visits. And then we ended up evaluating based on each department what we were seeing in the classroom in terms of literacy strategies. So you can see some of the data here. We don't have to focus on it, but just some of the range of numbers that we're seeing. And we ended up not being as critical as some of the numbers, say for ESL or PE or special education, just because there was only like six or three different classes visited. So, from a rough percentage base, that's not really a large enough sample size. But if you looked at CTE or math or social science, we had like 30 up to 30 classes visited. So, that's actually a decent number of rooms that we can start drawing some conclusions for. And we had to plan together just to make sure that the outcomes from the training were based on these effective instructional strategies. So this was one of the things we wanted to tie in some research towards to actually make sure what we wanted to see happening was happening in the class. We also investigated some student survey, and we actually had 268 student responses that had teachers who had taken some of our training, and we found some of the trends that we were able to see in the data, saying that the students agreed that it was obvious that learning new words was a priority in classes where their teachers had taken code classes or code training compared to non-code training classes. So this was something we wanted to see from a student perspective. Is was our data from walkthroughs actually showing that we were seeing similar trends from a student point of view? If we take a look at some of the research we had to do, we started with some of the code. So the code training that we had from Silver, Dewing, and Perini, and looked at, well, what were the outcomes we wanted of code? And if we want to see if those outcomes are happening, what's the best tool to measure that? So for example, like teachers knowing the four phases of code, that was something we could put together as an exit slip at the end of a workshop. We could do some sort of multiple choice. We could do some sort of free response, just to see if they were getting some of those basics. But then if it was more of, can they design a meaningful and relevant instructional routine, that might have been something where we had to actually look at some of the they were producing or seeing what it looked like in the classroom. So it was a little bit more qualitative in terms of the methodology, and it wasn't quite as cut or dry of did they get it or did they not get it. And that's where coaching follow-up was really essential too, because we could correct any mistakes that we saw in some of the data or some of the ways that we were seeing that teachers weren't getting some of the main ideas from the training. One of the other things we ended up doing too was we put together a data collection tool for some of our walkthroughs. And to ensure that this quantitative methodology was going to be replicable, we needed to go through and make sure everybody understood what the basis of for what we were looking for to actually qualify as, yes, I'm seeing a technique, or no, I'm not seeing a technique. So this was part of our tally sheet, and we had to go through and teach a bunch of the administrators, the counselors, the other teachers who were doing our classroom walkthroughs. We had to teach them what to actually look for in the class. So you can see we had examples of different categories or different indicators of our training, but we also had to have some non-examples. So for example, just having a word wall up in the room wasn't quite what we were looking for to show that they were having a positive learning environment for vocabulary instruction, but actually using the word wall was something we were looking for. And we had to norm that with the whole team. So we had a relevant and an actually like useful and effective tool for seeing if what we saw in the classroom was following up with what our professional development was aiming for teachers to be able to do. Another thing we had to do is, again, balance like the qualitative and quantitative. So we ended up having a little bit of quantitative data in terms of a Likert scale type of ranking for students. Students were able to give a 1 through 4 or 1 through 5 rating of how much they thought their teachers prioritized vocabulary instruction in the class. So this enabled us to get some quantitative data. And then it also enabled us to ask them some follow-up questions too on, well, what does it look like when your teachers are prioritizing academic vocabulary? And that could give us some more qualitative data to help us learn some of these impacts that we were having in the classroom based on our professional development that we put together. In terms of data analysis, when we specifically looked at evaluating the code workshop, this was something where at the end of the data collection, we wanted to see, well, what should we do next? What are we going to do with this data? So for the short term, we looked into, well, how can we change instruction in the fall? We follow up coaching with a lot of teachers. Are there any things that we can bring to their attention based on the data that we saw? During the training, can we have more intentionality on and repetition of word use that's being done? A lot of teachers were showing that it was a one and done activity. We needed to focus more on being intentional with repetition, and like these kids should be interacting with these words 5, 6, 7 times before we're asking them to really use it in some sort of authentic setting. A lot of teachers focused on not knowing the right quantity of words, so we can help teachers figure out a good balance for them. And then good ways to focus more on vocabulary, or to start to integrate both of these focus for the classroom. So either vocabulary strategies or vocabulary choices, and that's something we're going to use to evaluate our future workshops. And again, we can also use some of the data to help support that these trainings that we're doing are having impacts on what students are seeing in the classroom. So based on anonymous surveys from our students, we were able to see that they were more likely to learn new words if their teachers had taken these code classes. So it's showing up in the classroom, and students are noticing when their teachers are taking some of these trainings, because they're actually seeing that they're actually like learning new words in their classes. And then if they're learning new words, like they have activities associated with those words. It's not just a list of words that they have to spit back at some point. In terms of leading the collaborative activities, when I was working with the academic Tier 1 team, it was made up of teachers, counselors, administrators, coaches from all content areas, all grade levels. It's a really cool group to work with. And when we were norming, going through our data collection tool from here, I had some follow-up questions to help the teachers pinpoint some of their thoughts and what they were thinking in terms of what this walkthrough could look like. And we needed input from everybody because everybody was collecting this data for us. So I had people talking with shoulder partners where they saw instances in the classroom and things they wanted to ask questions about. Maybe they weren't sure if they should have counted a piece of data or not. Other non-examples they wanted to bring back. Again, these were teachers from all walks of the building, and they have a wide range of knowledge of what happens in their specific types of classes that I wouldn't have any clue about. What does vocabulary instruction look like in a music class? Those music teachers that were in the classroom, the orchestra and the band teacher, they had a lot better vibe on what that could possibly look like and how they use it. And so it was good to hear their input in terms of how they use vocabulary, because I just didn't have the background knowledge on how they perceived the vocabulary instruction. So it was really cool seeing their point of view for that use of the academic vocabulary. When we started looking into evaluating the use of Mayan versus Overdrive, it was something where we needed a lot of input from all across the building. I'm not a big user of Overdrive, but the librarians in the school are, and I needed their input because we were evaluating if we wanted to keep one or both of these pieces of technology. And so I had to have a good example of like what my beliefs and what my uses were, from the literacy specialist point of view, and in order to help find some common ground with the librarians. So we had slightly different needs, as you can see, but we also had some similarities. We both wanted tools such as annotation of the text and reading in multiple formats, ability to listen, read, and highlight, which is kind of cool. So this was something where collaborating with the librarians and seeing what their needs look like really opened up my eyes to tools that I could probably be using that they had access to. And the end product, we ended up deciding to get rid of the Mayan, which was kind of nice and refreshing because it wasn't a tool that was being used as much. And we had a tool that the librarians had access to that ended up being a much better product that I wouldn't have known about before without having talked to some of the librarians about their needs in the classroom. Next, supporting applications of technology. For some of this data, I was dealing with big data sets, 200, 300 students at a time. I need to be able to look at their survey results and say, okay, this is student A. They had these 8 teachers, only 2 of them had taken this professional development. I need to separate out all that data from their code teachers to their non-code teachers. So I ended up doing a lot of code writing, different version of code, a lot of code writing in Google Sheets, and I had to use some of that technology in order to separate out that data and then to see if it was a statistical significant difference between groups of students that had code teachers versus non-code teachers. Um, so that ended up getting some of that quantitative data, which was really essential to help us look at some actionable steps that we were going to be moving forward from. Same thing with the technology here when I was working with a couple teachers during in-classroom visits and follow-up coaching sessions, having that quick turnaround of the Google Docs in terms of commenting and tagging and posts and getting their input on stuff. And then some of it was even just some of the coaching on how to use some of the technology. So if it was just a one and done with some of our professional development, chances are we wouldn't be able to see much implementation of the code strategies. But with some of this follow up that we were doing, and specifically some technology follow up for a couple of teachers, we were actually able to see a lot more implementation in the classroom. So we were able to support teachers for how to use some of this new technology that we'd covered in the professional development. Now, in terms of professional dispositions, one of the things that I had to look into that was most uncomfortable for me was the evaluation process, and using that evaluation process as a formative, not a summative tool, because it's something we want to use to enable teachers to get better from. And so that was a really fine line to walk with the teacher in terms of, well, here's what I saw, or like, here's my observations. What do you think of them? And what do you think we can do to learn from these? How can we make ourselves better from this? So that was also a thing where that barrier between what I see and then what I talk to anybody else about, this evidence was only shared with this teacher. It wasn't a point of conversation with anybody else throughout the building, just because that would really break some trust boundaries in my evaluation. And that's, once you lose that trust with teachers, you can't really be very professional in terms of how they're going to view what those evaluations look like. And then it turns into more of like a gotcha type of a feeling and not a, well, gee, Pat's really trying to help me get better at this. And finally, when we were looking into just some of the ethical foundation of if we were using some of this student collected data, we wanted to make sure that we could remove any identifiers from students just for privacy's sake. If they had any sort of paperwork that said that you can't use my likeliness or my picture and photos or use any of this information in terms of something that could identify me for anybody outside the school, we had to really be careful with some of that. And also in terms of with dealing with teachers, we didn't want any of this data to be used in a negative point of view against the teacher, because if a teacher came across with, well, you're using this data to give me some sort of bad evaluation, first of all, that's not going to be very honest on our end. And second of all, it wouldn't give the teacher fair representation in terms of, hey, this is the data you collected. What if I get fired because of this? They've got better protections than that. They've got the right to due process. They've got the right of the 14th Amendment, I think, in order to say, like, you should go through some steps and there should be grounds and cause for a firing. Data that we were collecting here, none of it was ever intended to be able to identify back to a teacher for any sort of negative point of view. So we had to be really clear and careful with communicating that to the teachers. You can see some of the references just going back, but finally, this was a really cool internship where I got to explore many different aspects of the school, many different jobs that I wasn't aware of, and a really different viewpoint of how school functions from beyond a teacher point of view. So thanks. Have a great day.